will be Tseten, and then after Tseten we'll have page and pearl so that you are ready. Okay. Thank you. Tseten, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to quickly apologize in advance. I got sick earlier this week and have not made a full recovery, so I apologize if I sound congested or cough throughout the presentation. Please bear with me. Before I begin, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama for making opportunities like this possible for Tibetans in exile. I would also like to thank Men-Tsee-Khang and all of the incredible Tibetan doctors, staff, and students who have shared their knowledge, experiences, and wisdom with us throughout this program. Being able to learn directly from such talented and dedicated individuals, such as Tibetan physicians, has been such an honor, and it has been given me even greater appreciation for Tibetan medicine and the efforts made to preserve for future generations. My name is Tseten Dolkar, and I am a first-generation incoming senior at the University of Minnesota, majoring in biology and human physiology with a minor in psychology and public health. Today I'll be talking about what survived after Tibet lost its homeland, and specifically how Tibetan medicine survived in exile. I chose this topic not only to educate others about Tibetan history, but to also serve as a reminder for Tibetans ourselves because, especially growing outside of Tibet, we can slowly lose connection to where we come from. I feel that we Tibetans outside of Tibet can sometimes become somewhat ignorant of our past, including myself, because we have not personally lived through many of the experiences ourselves. I'm hoping that this presentation will remind everyone of the sacrifices Tibetans made to preserve our culture, language, religion, and identity after losing our homeland. It is important that we continue learning and speaking about our history so that the future generations do not forget where we come from and everything that was endured from our culture to survive today. I wanted to begin with a question. If your country was forcefully occupied tomorrow, what parts of your culture would survive? For Tibetans, one thing that survived was medicine, and I think that says a lot about how important medicine was to Tibetan identity and culture. Exile meant more than losing just land. Tibetans also risked losing language, religion, traditions, and identity. Tibetan medicine became one of the ways Tibetan preserved who they were after 1959. I have a few slides on some important facts about Tibet before I get into the history. This is the Tibetan flag, one of the strongest symbols of Tibetan identity and freedom. The snow lions here represent strength and fearlessness. The mountain represents Tibet, and the rising sun symbolizes freedom and happiness. For many Tibetans, the flag represents resistance and hope. Inside Tibet today, even displaying this flag can lead to severe punishment. Meanwhile, many of us outside of Tibet can wave it freely without even thinking twice about that privilege. This is a map of Tibet showing its 3 provinces. Itzang, which is the central Tibet, Kham, which is eastern, and Amdo, which is northern. Lhasa is located in Itzang, which is the capital. I think it's around here. Even today, many Tibetans strongly identify with these regions because they represent different histories, dialects, and traditions. These images show beautiful traditional clothing from Tibet's 3 provinces. The image on the left depicts the traditional clothing of the province Itzang, specifically the region known as Deba. The middle depicts the traditional clothing of the province Kham, specifically the region known as Letang. And the image on the right depicts the traditional clothing of the province Amdo, specifically the region known as Golok. Each region has distinct styles that reflect local traditions and geography. Traditional clothing continues to be an important way Tibetans preserve identity, and especially in exile communities. Even something as simple as clothing can become an act of cultural preservation. And this slide shows some important Tibetan cultural symbols. The yak right here is the physical representative animal of Tibet that represents survival and daily life in Tibet, while the snow lion is the mythical representative animal of Tibet, which symbolizes strength and fearlessness, which was also seen on the Tibetan flag. The three treasured jewels shown here are Si, Churu, which is coral, and Yu, which is turquoise, which symbolize protection, spirituality, and prosperity in Tibetan culture. These traditions and symbols are part of what Tibetans feared losing after the occupation began in 1950. When we lose cultural symbols, we slowly risk losing pieces of identity too. So before 1950, Tibet functioned as an independent Buddhist nation with its own government, language, culture, and traditions. Monasteries were not only religious institutions, but also centers for education, philosophy, and medicine. Tibetan medicine had already been practiced for centuries and was deeply connected to Tibetan Buddhism and holistic healing traditions. Because monasteries were also centers of medicine, preserving Tibetan medicine was deeply tied to preserving Tibetan culture itself. Medicine was never just about healing the body, it was also about preserving knowledge, philosophy, and community. On October 7, 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army entered eastern Tibet. Within weeks, Tibetan forces were defeated during the Battle of Chamdo. China described this invasion as a peaceful liberation, while many Tibetans viewed it as the beginning of an occupation. This marked the beginning of major political and cultural changes in Tibet and threatened traditional Tibetan systems of education, religion, and medicine. And for many Tibetans, the fear wasn't only losing land, it was losing an entire way of life. In 1951, Tibetan representatives signed what became known as the 17-Point Agreement. China claimed the agreement would preserve Tibetan autonomy and religion while officially bringing Tibet under Chinese rule. However, many Tibetans believed it was signed under pressure and coercion. As Chinese control increased, many Tibetans feared the gradual loss of Tibetan cultural and medical traditions. In March of 1959, tensions in Tibet reached a breaking point. After fears spread that the Dalai Lama would be arrested, thousands of Tibetans gathered in Lhasa to protect him. On March 10, 1959, a major uprising began against Chinese rule. Days later, the uprising was violently suppressed, and thousands of Tibetans were killed, imprisoned, or forced to flee. On March 31, 1959, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama arrived safely in India after escaping across the Himalayas with the help of countless voluntary Tibetan resistance fighters known as Tseten. Tseten, meaning 4 rivers and 6 ranges, was a Tibetan guerrilla resistance group formed mainly by Khamba warriors who were willingly risk their lives to protect His Holiness and resist Chinese occupation. Imagining having to leave your homeland behind overnight and not knowing if you would ever see it again. It sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, it was the reality of many Tibetans in Tibet. For many Tibetans, escaping Tibet meant risking their lives. Thousands crossed the Himalayas on foot through freezing temperatures, starvation, and exhaustion. Many did not survive the journey. It's hard to even imagine making that journey on foot through the Himalayas while carrying your entire future with you. Tibetans carried more than physical belongings with them. They carried sacred texts, religion, traditions, language, and ancient Tibetan medical knowledge into exile. Tibetans could not carry their country with them, but they carried their culture. In 1959, uprising became one of the most important moments in modern-day Tibetan history. Even today, March 10th remains deeply important to Tibetans worldwide. Every year, Tibetans continue peaceful protests and demonstrations to commemorate the uprising and honor those who have suffered or died. For many Tibetans, March 10th was not just history. It is something still emotionally alive today. As Tibetans outside of Tibet, we are fortunate to protest and speak openly about our history without fear of imprisonment. During China's Cultural Revolution, Tibet experienced widespread cultural destruction. Thousands of monasteries were destroyed, religious practices were restricted, Tibetan texts were burned, and cultural traditions were threatened. Even today, Tibetan culture continues to face suppression. Tibetan language education has increasingly been replaced by Mandarin Chinese instruction in schools, threatening future generations' connection to Tibetan language and identity. Language is one of the strongest ways for cultures to survive, which is why losing it is so devastating. Tibetan medicine was also endangered because many medical texts and institutions were destroyed during this period. However, Tibetans in exile worked to preserve and rebuild these traditions in India. The next slide is a little graphic, so you can look away if you get disturbed. Even after decades of occupation, resistance in Tibet has continued. Since 2009, over 150 Tibetans inside Tibet and China have self-immolated in protest against Chinese rule. For those of you who don't know what self-immolation means, technically it is a way to commit suicide by putting yourself on fire. Many called for freedom, the return of Dalai Lama, and the preservation of Tibetan culture. Many Tibetans viewed self-immolation as an act of desperation intended to draw international attention to the situation in Tibet. One quote often associated with these protests is, "My body is the only weapon I have left." This quote really shows the level of desperation many Tibetans feel. India became one of the most important places for Tibetan cultural survival. After granting asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959, India allowed Tibetans to establish schools, monasteries, settlements, and cultural institutions in exile. In 1961, the Men-Tsee-Khang was re-established in Dharamsala and became essential in preserving Tibetan medicine through education, medical texts, and healing traditions. Without exile communities in India, Tibetan medicine may have not survived the same way it has today. Being here in India and learning about Tibetan medicine firsthand has made me realize how important exile communities have been in preserving Tibetan identity and culture. Without exile communities in India, many part of the Tibetan culture may have not survived the same way as they have today. Despite exile, occupation, and cultural destruction, Tibetans preserved many parts of their identity as language, religion, medicine, identity, and resilience. Tibetan medicine survived because Tibetans refused to let their knowledge, culture, and identity to disappear. One of the most powerful things about Tibetan history is that even without a homeland, Tibetans continued finding ways to preserve who they were through language, religion, medicine, and community. Tibetans lost their country, but not their identity. And I think that's one of the most powerful examples of cultural resilience in the world. One thing that stood out to me while learning about Tibetan medicine is how holistic it is. Tibetan medicine focuses not only on physical illness, but also on emotional balance, compassion, prevention, and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. Even today, Tibetan medicine continues through exile communities and institutions like Men-Tsee-Khang around the world. Tibetan medicine preserved more than healing, it preserved a culture. And I think that's why learning about Tibetan medicine here in India has felt so meaningful to me personally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tseten. That was really a profound presentation. Sorry about all the noises that we are hearing, but we do need that, right? Our food, just to nourish ourselves. I think we have a question there. I thought someone was raising hand. Any questions we have? And I know for our students here, and certainly almost all our faculty have a deep understanding and knowledge of what Tseten just presented. But it's really reaffirming that someone like Tseten, who was born and raised in the US, has such a close connection with Tibetan culture, particularly Tibetan medicine, Tibetan Buddhism, and having come here and having that reaffirming feeling. And so I really want to thank you, Tseten, for sharing that with us.